Thanks everyone for waiting. We'll now get underway. Uh, Phoebe, you there? Do you have? Great. Thank you. So, first of all, on behalf of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Plant Success in Nature and Agriculture, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the many lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise the valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So my name is Ian Wright. I'm a Chief Investigator here at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Plant Success. And today I'm excited to introduce Associate Professor Vanessa Adams. Oh, I should say that I'm zooming in from Guringai country from north of Sydney today. Vanessa is an Associate Professor in Conservation and Planning at the University of Tasmania and, and an ARC Future Fellow. Her research focuses on modelling dynamic socio-ecological systems to inform conservation decisions that improve ecosystems and the communities that they support. So this means her research is broadly aligned with three themes: ecological modelling, socio-economic aspects of conservation, and conservation decision theory. Vanessa partners with relevant government agencies and NGOs to ensure that her research is relevant to policymakers and is positioned to influence on-ground conservation. Thanks so much for being here, Vanessa, and we really appreciate your time today. So we'll let Vanessa get started. Of course, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just put them into the chat and we'll do our best to address them at the end. Please remember to mute your microphones. And over to you, Vanessa. Thanks so much.
Awesome, thank you. Welcome all. I know that what I do is possibly a little bit different to what many of the plant scientists in the Centre of Excellence do. So hopefully you'll enjoy something slightly different. The theme around this talk is really how to retain plant species in the landscape. And coming at that from the fact that I'm very much a plant person. I absolutely love them. I think they're marvelous. I will love watching them come and go in the landscape. And my work is around how to model those dynamics, both from an ecological view, but a social view. Thinking about that system is very much one that is shaped through our relationships to nature. I realized Ian introduced me. I don't know most of you, so I thought I better introduce myself. I have a varied background. I am a trained mathematician, actuarial scientist, demographic modeler, turned social scientist, and general human people person. So you'll get a range of methods and findings throughout this talk. And we'll start from global and land very local in Tasmania, Lutruwita, where I live now. I'm very privileged to be able to walk amongst absolutely magnificent landscapes that were shaped by Indigenous peoples, and that we are absolutely the custodians of their caring for these places. So we'll start, as promised, by the global scene, which is kind of the graphs that keep me up at night occasionally. And that's these are graphs from about 10 years ago, so it's only gotten worse, sadly not better. And the question that I often ponder is, if we have increasing levels of global protection, that top graph where at our global commitments, we've now met targets to protect more than 17% of land mass, close to 10% of sea. If we've done all of this work to protect places, to stop the bulldozers, why do we continue to observe decreasing extent of ecosystems, in particular our forest and our plant cover? So are protected areas really doing their job at retaining those species in the landscape so that they can evolve, so they can respond to that natural climate adaptation and expression of traits we want them to be able to do? And furthermore, even within our protected areas, we're experiencing increasing threats like invasive alien species, which displace our native plants, and often have these plant fire cycle feedback loops, which can also fundamentally change our disturbance regimes. So essentially, do we have the right tools in our toolbox to look after species, to retain them in the landscape, to be able to have that in situ conservation, to allow species to evolve and adapt to future conditions? Or do we need to think outside the box and come up with new solutions? And so the thing that's, quite curious about Australia is we're very, very good at protecting land in terms of land mass. We've exceeded our global targets. We're also exceptionally good at clearing land. So we have the unfortunate number of being one of 10 global deforestation fronts. So those are the things you see in red in this global map. They're areas that have not only high levels of forest clearing, but accelerating rates of forest clearing. So the east coast of Australia has been named a deforestation front. And the drivers of those losses are quite intermingled and challenging to confront. They're often drivers that reflect the fact that we are humans and we do need fibers for our clothes, timber for our homes, and other plants to feed ourselves. And that often these choices to convert our landscape to meet our needs often interact with things like disturbance regimes like fires or climate change. Um, the other overlay is, of course, that sometimes we just make bad choices about what we do in our landscape and where humans make anticipatory changes about responses to government policy. So a lot of the loss in Australia is very much avoidable and not best use of our limited land resources. So fundamentally understanding whether we are making the right choices about where to use our landscapes and how to use our landscapes is going to inform the types of things we can do to retain plant species in their natural habitats. And so this is work that Rachel Gallagher and myself embarked upon when I was at Macquarie with Ian and others. And the question we thought about was, what is the strongest lineage between a government and their obligations to look after nature, with an emphasis on plant species because we like plants? And they're the things that are most exposed to the choices we make about clearing land, because once you pluck them out of their place in that landscape, they can be very much gone. And we thought about this from a view of endemic plant species, thinking, well, those are the ones that only that country that they are endemic to have that opportunity to conserve them. So if we think about conservation as a global good, but with fundamentally local actions or obligations, then endemics have quite a strong lineage for expectations of our government. So the map up top is the richness of endemic plant species by country, or botanical country in this case. And you can see that really 5 countries hold the vast majority of plant wealth in the global sense. So that's Australia, China, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico. And there's some sort of close short runners right after that, like Madagascar and the United States, that also hold quite a lot of species. But really, we're looking at, the ability of a few countries to do the right thing and to meet their global ambitions to look after those plants, to retain that overall genetic resource that we all so desperately kind of rely on for our quality of life. So along that backdrop, we started to think about, well, what might be the ways that we can look after those species? What are our obligations? What are the backdrops around what might hinder us from meeting those assessments? And so we looked at modification, hypothesizing that potentially where things are highly modified, we've already cleared things, perhaps we have less of a motivation to look after what's left, or maybe things are already gone and we don't even realize it. So again, you can focus in on Australia and realize what an unusual place it is. It has about half of our country is close to what is considered or termed wilderness, in that it is a largely unmodified, also largely uninhabited area. Very few spatial signals of human activity, through to modified, practically a parking lot, really strong urban areas or cropped lands. And then we thought about, well, what are the types of things that countries traditionally do to retain their plant species? And of course, protected areas are one of those things. And you can start to see some kind of overlays in terms of where things are protected and therefore where are they intact or not. And then we thought about what are the global commitments that countries have made. And aside from protecting land as one way of stopping those bulldozers, we've made a commitment to do a complete assessment of all endemic species. So we wanted to understand whether governments are actually doing that and if those choices by governments are at all interrelated to their choices of land use. And what we found was that it's actually very hard to find a strong predictor of governments' choices. So on the top is your map of proportion of endemic plant species that have been assessed, noting that countries have committed to have 100% assessment. So we should be understanding the status and the distribution and the conservation needs of our plant species if we have an intention to protect them, look after them. Australia is doing reasonably terribly at that commitment. They're kind of in about the 25% of our plant species have received an assessment. And we thought, well, why would that be? Like, if any country should be capable of conducting the most basic of paperwork, looking for a species, understanding where that species is, planning for its conservation, it should be a place like Australia. We have wealth, we have knowledge, we have capacity. What on earth would explain these variances? And so we captured global data around human development, the extent to which our landscapes are modified, and just an overall level of richness, thinking, well, maybe the more you have, the harder it is to get through this task. I mean, 20,000 assessments is quite a lot, so maybe that's just the basic barrier. And really, if I draw your attention to the yellow and the yellow hash at the top of the curve, most of these graphs, China, South Africa, and the US are doing really, really well at meeting these targets. So they're sort of outliers in the positive side of things. They have lots of species. They have pretty variable levels of modification, pretty variable levels of development, but are doing really, really well at looking after their species in terms of at least conducting the assessments, understanding where these species are, what their conservation needs are, and what the plan might be to look after those species. In contrast, oh, there we go. Australia is doing quite terribly. We're below average on all of these. So we have a reasonable level of development. We're one of the most developed countries in terms of this metric that we drew from, and yet we're doing really poor job of just assessing our species. We are about kind of 30% modified. So, if you think back to that map that I showed you, where our arid zone is classified in that global scale as wilderness and our coastal zones are toast, we kind of have about 30% modified and 70% intact. And so really we have lots and lots of land that we should be doing science on and understanding where those species are, and yet we are again below average against that trend line of our ability to assess our species. And similarly with our species richness, we do have a lot of species. We are one of 5 kind of global botanical countries that hold most of that plant wealth. And that's true. That could be a barrier through getting through all of those assessments. And yet again, if you look at China, South Africa, the US, they have more species than us, and they've completed nearly 100% of those assessments. And so really fundamentally, what we found in terms of where Australia stood in this global figure was quite alarming to us. It didn't meet any of our hypotheses about what those barriers to action might be, and our models didn't really explain Australia's behavior. So fundamentally, the question of how do we retain plant species boils down to 3 choices that a government and individuals can make, and that's that you have to assess conservation status. You fundamentally cannot manage what you do not know. And so choosing to not complete assessments is actually still an active choice, and it's active choice to be absent of the information you would need to look after something. So it's a fundamentally a political choice at play that's not explained by other observable patterns. Where you find that species are rare, unique, or at risk, which to be honest is most of Australia's plant species, because we have such high levels of endemicity and then also such high levels of clearing, you need to protect and restore. And that really comes down to using the existing tools in the toolbox, but doing it better. Where your plants are under threat or potentially widespread, then you need landscape scale management, and that comes down to cooperation across tenures and governments. And so these are fundamentally spatiotemporal questions of where, when, and how to intervene. So again, Rachel and I, Ian and others, started to think about, well, okay, so we haven't done our assessments, and what information will we need to do those assessments, and how would we begin to tackle this? And Rachel had compiled and cleaned all of the botanical records that could be found for all the species in Australia, so close to 22,000 species of cleansed occurrence records, which are the backbone of modeling distributions. And we embarked on trying to have a complete set of distribution maps for all species in Australia. So really just an insurmountable amount of work that Rachel did on that compiling and cleaning occurrences. And then we decided that not all species are going to have the right number of occurrences to fully model, but we didn't want to lose those in our data set. So we made a choice that if they were quite rare, that we would model those as an area of occupancy, an AOO, whereas where we had records that were spanning, say, all of Northern Australia, we would accept a sort of overestimate of their range and model with an extent of occurrence, EOO. And then for the rest of them, we did bioclimatic modeling. And so we have essentially a probabilistic occurrence of where we might find them. But for most of our further work around where to look for plant species that were rare or threatened and what might be causing those threats, we wanted range maps. And so we worked with Core Meow and others in the BN network to come up with the best available methods and science to reduce that rich probability of distribution down to range maps. So we converted those with some basic modeling rules around how to best retract a range map down to a set of higher probability areas. Ultimately, that means that we do have a data set of close to 22,000 species of modeled ranges, which becomes the backbone of understanding where and when we might be able to act to look after this really rich plant biodiversity. And I mean, we'll keep coming back to different versions of these maps. So you know, some patterns might stick out to you already, like huge amounts of diversity on the East Coast, where we're also incredibly good at clearing footballs worth of those plant species each year. Northern Australia presents a lot of opportunity as it's not yet lost, but is certainly under threat. The Southwest is an absolutely rich and amazing place, and pretty much all of Tasmania is endemic and special, so that's an easy place to prioritize all of it. So next we need to understand what is under threat, and in Australia, the drivers of loss fundamentally come back to our agricultural needs, and therefore land capability and what our underlying systems are able to grow becomes very important to understanding and predicting both past use and future risk. And so we embarked on a nationally consistent way of mapping land capability using existing maps where possible, unifying them, and then remodeling to gap fill. And lastly, obviously, we need to understand where we've already acted, where plants should, in theory, be retained because they're protected. And by being protected, we hypothesize they should be managed well in terms of other underlying threats. And so the protected area state covers about 17% of Australia's landmass. Much of that is in the arid zones where Indigenous peoples have chosen to enroll their land in Indigenous protected areas. So it's a very specific type of biome and plant species that's well protected. There's certainly gaps in this estate, and nationally, we track our progress against our policy commitments by looking at proportion of bioregion protected under the National Reserve Strategy. So you can see areas in light green are areas that haven't met our current obligations or targets under those strategies, and this is how the government themselves tracks their progress and thinks through where priorities might be. So of course, the east coast of Australia would be considered a priority for further protection. Our mulga and inland grazing ranges are also considered a priority for protection. And sort of areas in the southwest of Western Australia are also considered areas for protection. And so I guess I circle back to that first graph of the things that might keep me personally up at night. I fundamentally do a lot of my work on how to put protected areas in, but what if they're not working? Like we have this backdrop of continued loss. We're doing more, but more bad stuff is happening. So fundamentally, maybe they're not designed to do the thing we need them to do. And so drawing on sort of a long disciplinary history of studying whether protected areas are potentially biased. In other words, we're really good at putting them at the top of mountains where they're high and far from anything we would ever want to clear. So if that's their history, are they fundamentally not fit for purpose in a current and future landscape where we absolutely have to stop bulldozers and rethink how we feed ourselves and clothe ourselves? Which brought, again, Rachel and I to the question of, we're very good at tracking protected area progress in terms of ecosystem or bioregion, but are they covering species? And within those species, are they covering particular traits? Or are there whole types of species and whole types of functional traits that we're losing from our landscape because of that bias? And so we wanted to look at those kind of basic principles of comprehensiveness, adequacy, and representativeness of our protected area system, but at a species level with those range maps. And then thinking through the trait data that we have on tap. And we tried a number of things, but really boiled down to deciding to just use growth form as a basic signal of the things we might choose to clear or not, and therefore be losing from our landscapes. And then we asked, are there gaps at a species or functional trait level? And if so, then to what extent does having your distribution as a species outside of a protected area put you at risk from further loss due to agricultural land uses? And so to do that, because I mainly like people and social science these days, I constructed a qualitative narrative of land use based on a number of sources, and then we used that to construct a conceptual model to guide quantitative analyses. And then using that, we asked the question of what are the spatial patterns of land use based on that narrative at continental level? And do those vary between bioregions and species? So if we're tracking our policy commitments at a bioregion, is that potentially missing important signals about species level progress? And then fundamentally, do we have a strong statistical model that tells us what the relationship is between the amount of a species that's protected, the amount that remains outside of protection that's at risk, or the amount that was historically lost? So this is the conceptual model, and essentially the narrative is one where our landscapes are fundamentally shaped by their historic use and occupation and nurturing from indigenous peoples who've been the custodians of these lands. And so as people have lived in these landscapes, they have shaped them. And the distributions of our woody growth forms absolutely reflect the different fire disturbance regimes that have become critical kind of disturbance regimes for those ecosystems. When colonialists arrived and occupied these landscapes, they therefore then began to occupy areas that had been traditionally formed through fire, were therefore grassier, and they began to inhabit those areas. Where they needed to explore and move into new areas, they began to clear woody growth forms because they were in their way. So our colonial occupation and our history of loss in areas that were suitable for agriculture predated any opportunity to stop those choices through protection. So there's a sort of history of preemption where we lost before we ever had the opportunity to retain or protect. In modern history, as we began to protect, we set targets to protect areas of things that are quite rare and to try to capture those whole populations. So the smaller and rarer you are, the higher your proportion of or target is when we plan for you in the landscape. So in theory, your range or extent should predict the amount of you that is protected. It also should predict the amount of you that is exposed to clearing, because if you are very range limited, a single bulldozer could take out your entire population equally, just as we aim to protect 100% of that area. So with a few sort of very simple to observe predictors, we should be able to predict and confirm this narrative. And in conducting the spatial analyses to test that narrative, we did find that land capability, that suitability of the land to support agricultural land uses, is an incredibly strong predictor of clearing both past and present. In other words, humans have an innate idea of what will grow. We are very good at observing what can grow in the landscape and therefore what is going to be suitable for our agricultural needs at a near 100% hit rate. And that is a very logical and rational response to humans as part of a natural system. Levels of protection and clearing are inversely related, which also is that just general signal of first we arrived and began clearing and occupying landscapes before we ever began to value and protect them in different ways. And that holds at both a bioregion and a species level. And then putting that data into the path analysis to test the narrative found that there was large support for most pieces of that analysis. So the more capable the land is that you as a species occupy, the more likely you are to have been heavily cleared. In other words, the bulldozers got in and cleared you and put in crops. If you're woody as a growth form, you're far more likely to have been cleared. And that's just a basic, you're in the way. We cannot grow a crop until we've cleared a paddock so that we can replant it. That our policies quite explicitly protect proportion of range, and the smaller and rarer you are, the more we want to protect of you. Therefore, there's an inverse relationship between your extent and the proportion that should be protected. Also was confirmed. So in general, we can observe those national reserve strategies and targets confirmed through the actual distribution of our protected areas. And the less capable the land is that you occupy, the more protected you will be. So there's both preemption, that we never had a chance to protect you if you happen to be a plant species that occupies high capability lands, but also we do prefer to protect low capability land. So we both preempted opportunities on agricultural landscapes, and we've actively avoided those battles by going to high and far areas. And what this means is that we have areas in hash that are heavily cleared where our opportunities to protect species is nearly gone, and there's a fleeting window of opportunity. There are areas where we've protected expansive landscapes, and those are amazing things, but they're very specific geographically, and those are in gray. And then there's a landscape of availability and opportunity, which is sort of your unhashed area. And there's proactive opportunities to get in and look after full landscapes before bulldozers arrive. And those are primarily in the north, but also some fleeting remnants in the southeast corner. And then there's small slivers of reactive opportunities where the landscape is one that's primarily converted and agricultural now, but still pockets of species exist and with enough of them left to actually look after them. And those are reactive opportunities where you'll probably need new tools in the toolbox because the fragments are so small and the land is so expensive. So in terms of policy briefings up to government, the answers to them were that really your reactive protection, probably your nature positive market opportunities reside in the southeast and southwest of Australia. Those where you would want to put in money or packages to purchase large properties to really build a reserve system that gives you landscape scale retention of species are in the north, the Daly Basin, Cape York, Tiwi Islands. Those areas are starting to experience accelerating loss. And so that proactive opportunity may well be a closing opportunity. And that given the eastern coastline is both a global deforestation hotspot and a highly biodiverse area, prioritizing protection, even where it might be political battles, may be necessary. Yeah, I guess from me and my kind of social sciencey geeking out, it was quite exciting that the path analysis supports that qualitative narrative of we arrived, we cleared, we primarily lost species, and then we began to protect. And when we began to protect, we began to protect in a high and far biased way. And so the choices and the ways we value landscapes absolutely have shaped and are kind of confirmed by that narrative. And it does point to the fact that really we're at that moment where if we want to retain species, we will have to confront and be quite honest about those trade-offs and battles. You will have to stop bulldozers. That will fundamentally mean changes in agricultural landscapes, and we do still need to eat and produce. And so we have to think about the best uses of our very limited land. And then I do lots of spatial prioritization. So of course I wanted to understand if at a species level, a spatial prioritization of areas most important for plant biodiversity would match that narrative and those opportunities of kind of hotspots of proactive and reactive opportunity. So this is a map generated with a tool called zonation. And really it can be considered. Areas in red are highly irreplaceable. They are areas that are most important to ensure you protect all species, at least in some place. And so they really tell us areas that we would call either key biodiversity areas or key plant areas that should deserve protection. And if that's not possible, then certainly to think about alternative arrangements to look after that biodiversity. And this is, of course, assuming that we haven't lost some of these places. So the next step in this is to overlay areas that have been cleared, areas that have been protected, and then areas that are potentially in more of a gradient of modification where we can think about how to recover, restore, or look after and maintain those species and their assemblages. And the thing about the red that I think we might intuitively all know is that those areas of highest importance for our plant biodiversity tend to be coastal, tend to be where we live, tend to be areas where we crop, recreate. And so the opportunities to have that kind of level of conflict between protection and other needs and other uses in the landscape are really high. And they're fundamentally on primarily freehold land that may never be available to us on the open market to protect. And so we absolutely have to think about what motivates people to look after land and to love nature and be a part of the solution. So that brings me to like very new work and work that I think is quite exciting. And that's the question of if we need to work in these landscapes, I think people intuitively think they have to pay for that. And that may be true in some landscapes, but I think there's actually a huge amount of opportunity to explore voluntary conservation measures on private land. And so the question that we're seeking to answer is essentially what happens in voluntary programs, what draws people into voluntary programs, and what kind of basic advice or tweaking of programmatic design can you put in place that leverages people's innate connection to nature and innate goodwill and self-investment in the place they love and live in. And if you give them the right information in the right way, can you give up to them and they'll just go about the business and do things better, look after nature better, and will species and ecosystems respond? So for this work, we're drawing on what's termed the noticing nature cycle in the literature. And this sort of emerged in response to what was a kind of narrative around the extinction of experience, that as humans move to cities, we're becoming less connected to nature. As we become less connected to nature, a whole host of health and well-being impacts occur. We become less happy, less attuned to our overall well-being, less healthy, but also we become disconnected to nature, more likely to exhibit sort of negative environmental behaviors. And so the literature has thought about, well, what's the inverse of that? Can you help people reconnect to nature? Does that have positive personal health and well-being benefits? But also, does it increase your pro-environmental behaviors? So we thought this is quite an authentic cycle, one that makes sense to us as researchers when we reflect on our own relationships to nature, our own gardening practices, our own conservation practices. It accords with the stories that people tell us about what happens when they realize that they have something special on their property, that they saw a species for the first time, that they changed a practice and noticed it worked. And so we wanted to leverage this noticing nature cycle to think through the small barriers that are at play for individuals, to try to alleviate those barriers and to then monitor those changes both on a social and ecological level. So the first thing we had to ask was essentially with voluntary programs, and specifically here I'll present Land for Wildlife early results. Do program participants come to those programs because there's just fundamentally a different segment of society? Are they on average more connected, or demographically a different type of person? So what we did was we drew upon a data set from collaborators who had asked a series of nature connection questions. That's a series of questions that access the different ways that people might feel nature connected. And that was a national scale. So essentially what they found was on a scale of 0 to 10, Australia sits at about a 6 on nature connection. So just a bit above average, not terrible, not poor, pretty okay. Tasmania within that data set, not statistically significant, but ever so slightly higher. And then as people were entering into Land for Wildlife and Wild Tracker, which are specific programs that we were monitoring in Tasmania, we were asking the same set of questions. What we found was that they are significantly higher on that nature connection cycle. So people are coming into these programs because of some innate aspects of who they are and how they connect to nature. So they are most certainly higher on that scale. Whether these programs can nudge them even higher, who knows, but is that an opportunity to leverage that volunteerism, but also astuteness and curiosity and connection to nature to do more? Like we're hypothesizing the answer is yes. And I'll just say I presented this to a group of these people at a symposium, and they themselves were like I think this really felt true to them. Like there was an immediate moment of like, you see me in the audience. The next question is then, is this related to them just naturally doing more? And again, the answer is absolutely yes. Out of, a scale of 0 to 100%, like about 80% of them are just organically managing their land for wildlife with very specific wildlife needs in mind. 90% of them were saying that they plant natives either to restore native habitat or they're changing their gardening practices in and around their houses. Close to 90% of them are already doing active invasive plant management as well as feral predator management. And about 50% of them are having conversations with their neighbors, trying to get their neighbors engaged. And in our larger, more peri-urban and rural properties, this becomes really important, where what we need them to do is to work as a collaborative set of communities to deal with landscape scale threats, not just property level threats. So this is a group of people already doing most of the things right. So whether we can nudge them to do even more is sort of an open-ended question, but it tells you the power of these collectives. And if we can find that this works for those that are voluntarily entering these programs, perhaps it tells us pathways to also nudge those neighbors that are perhaps not as organically going to come to us and just do this on their own. And so the ultimate question over the next 3 years will be to ask the question of what happens over time as participants notice and kind of fall in love with, and then manage and connect and reconnect and kind of cyclically move through that each year as nature goes through its natural cycles and humans go with them. Measuring changes in ecosystem structure, exploring what wildlife appear on camera traps, and redoing those surveys with people and just asking qualitatively their own observations around their personal practices of land management and why noticing has or has not influenced that. I guess coming back to my promise at the top of the talk was that, for me, this is fundamentally about retaining plants in the landscape, first and foremost, and then where we have failed species and where we failed ourselves, to be frank, then to look at ex situ options of seed banking, gene banking, and modifications to retain them. That being said, obviously there are opportunities to protect and conserve. But with climate change ramping up, translocations will have to be considered, which means we do need to understand the genetics of plant species, climate predictions, who owns land, who has a say over what can or cannot move in between those, and ultimately the law around movement of those genetic resources across borders. So if we want to be ready for climate and to retain species in the landscape, we will fundamentally have to begin to confront that this is essentially about wildlife gardening, moving plants, being ready to take risks, and understanding what the legal barriers are in doing so. And while I am a 100% in situ conservation kind of person, because it's what gets me going when I go into my garden or out onto my conservation properties and when I work with partners, the reality is that there will be switch points for some species where if we want to retain those genetic resources into the future to better understand them, reintroduce them, perhaps captive breed them, we will have to, as a decision theory, be able to identify when we need to cut our losses and move from in situ to ex situ conservation, or where we need to hedge our bets because our plants are so rare and range restricted that the chance of one climate driven event happening and taking out a whole population becomes higher. So these are the research frontiers I would hope to explore going into the future. And of course, I do think people come first. I think that if you want to get things done, you have to understand what ticks, kind of gets people going and reconnect people into that, not to assume that it's money, to better understand what makes people fall in love with place, look after place, and change the ways they individually behave, and removing structural barriers that just make it a bit too hard to do the right thing. So thank you. Thanks to all of my amazing collaborators who are contributing to this work and more. And thanks for taking a bit of a journey on plant science and in situ conservation.
Thank you, Vanessa, for a wonderful, engaging talk. Do people have questions? Please feel free to put your question into the chat, or indeed unmute your microphone and ask Vanessa a question.
Yeah, go for it.
If you feel emboldened enough to do so. Perhaps I'll get us started, Vanessa, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, go for it.
So that was so fascinating on a whole range of levels. I was interested to follow up this idea that Australia, we on average sit at what, 6 out of 10 in terms of our nature positive attitudes.
Yeah.
So clearly we need to be doing better in order to get plant conservation more seriously onto the political agenda.
Yep.
So I suppose we need to try and get both the politicians to higher on than 6 out of 10, or at least the general public who might sway the local politicians to higher numbers. So do you have any sort of some thoughts or insights about what are we doing wrong, or what could we be doing more of to try and slide people up the scale enough to start taking a bit more responsibility for the environment and plant conservation in Australia?
Now, that's a really interesting question, because I think that some people are innately attuned to the changes around them, those seasonal changes, the things that we do that influence our environment, and while others are not. And there's been this sort of hypothesis that perhaps it's about us living in cities or having opportunities to connect to nature, and that has been largely shown to not hold true with some really fascinating experiments around the kind of COVID period where people had to stay indoors but still connected to nature through their balconies, watching insects come to their gardens, having just individual reflective time and practice kind of forced at home. And so I think that actually demonstrates quite an interesting pathway in that it's not about having these amazing experiences in wild places or feeling remote and alone in nature. It can be all those little things that happen within your own gardens, within those opportunities to realize that you are absolutely a part of that cycle. What you do can have negative impacts, but also really simple things you do, like pulling weeds in your back garden, like suddenly everything begins to respond to that. And so, for example, we're mirroring the work that I've just presented to you on the land for wildlife with Gardens for Wildlife, which is all about literally you could have a balcony through to a huge garden, and encouraging those environmental behaviors. And we're testing the extent to which citizen science and other opportunities to notice nature might influence, and whether you compare those with just positive and simple calls to action. That's about getting broader public involved. In terms of politicians, my personal theory is that we've let an incorrect narrative go on for far too long, that you cannot have wealth and nature, that there is a trade-off to be made, and we allow particular narratives to pervade public, and some of our politicians are incredibly good at telling that story in a way that sways people out of a place of fear rather than a place of leadership. And so I think finding ways to put science, probably from a political ecology and historical land use space, into that kind of public domain that provide really clear and critical evidence that that's simply not the case, and that nature serves to be a bipartisan policy space because it is part of our political and national defense. We cannot be healthy and safe if we don't have nature. We cannot feed ourselves if we don't have both good agricultural crops and crop wild relatives. We cannot do all the things we plan on doing now and into the future if we aren't looking after the environment, just as we look after our other aspects of national defense.
Thank you. Michael Turvo has his hand up. Michael, are you there to unmute and ask Vanessa a question?
Yes, I'd love to. Going back to, first I want to say that is an incredible amount of work with a lot of modeling, and it brings me great joy to know it's there. With the earlier work with extent of occurrence and extent of occupancy modeling of all those species, I know all of the Australian state governments have signed under the Memorandum of Understanding for all using the Common Assessment Method to align with IUCN and all of that. I do know that in Queensland, capacity for a lot of that modelling is one of the limiting factors with getting species assessed. Is there any capacity for industry, government, that sort of thing, to access those species distributions and EOOs and that sort of thing that can then be incorporated into that sort of common assessment method? Because that's really cool data and really important, and I know it's certainly causing Queensland to drag their feet with their assessments and that sort of thing.
That's a really good question. I think so. Rachel Gallagher is on the National Threatened Species Committee. I think she's talked to, and we've sort of briefed governments that the data could immediately be used to identify your hit list of rare and range restricted species, which become kind of high priority for assessment. They could also be used to immediately give you a sense of those that have had likely greatest loss in extent, which also tells you something about their threat and the IUCN kind of threat listing. And then looking at, so in general, yes, I think she's even launched the data on a repository so that governments could download it and use it. We've tried to give them some basics, like look for the ones that are really tiny, they're rare, look for the ones where you've had a huge amount of likely loss in their extent. That tells you their threat, and mainly that it's our choices to clear them that's threatening them. And then looking at what South Africa and a few other countries have done, where they're botanically just massively rich, but have still also done all of their assessments. What have they done? And they've essentially grouped species by geography or traits or ecosystem type, and then done kind of groups of them at a time, knowing that they often have shared conservation needs or regimes like fire, disturbance, similar threats. You can do them kind of in bulk. And so there's ways to get through it pretty quickly. And then if you discover that there's a number that are likely to be threatened, you can do that more targeted research that they might need for those full assessments. So in general, yes, and there are no excuses.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I shall talk to the herbarium about it and just sort of shuffle them along a bit. So thank you so much, Vanessa. It was a really awesome presentation.
Do other people have questions? We've got Vanessa here. She's excited to answer your questions and hear your thoughts. If not, I can certainly ask. We could ask, talk for hours. Barbara has come on. Just put on her camera. Barbara, you got a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could just say, like, obviously, like there must be some quite cool statistical models behind a lot of these maps you're showing. I wondered if you could just sort of say a little bit more about what are kind of the techniques you can use to sort of cope with this, or the spatial correlation in your data set?
Yeah, so we did some so for the basic distribution modeling, we started with essentially maximum entropy modeling, and then worked with Corey Mao, who's thought a lot about how you can reduce those statistical models to ranges through like range bagging and choosing the right thresholds based on statistical signals. If you can't have experts go through one by one, so traditionally experts are like, oh, I think this is the right threshold. He's done a lot of statistical work on how to best identify those thresholds. So we were one of his first guinea pigs in just using his code around that kind of range bagging method. For prioritizations, that was my first foray into zonation, because everyone says how easy it is, and it is. It's awesome, but essentially it statistically iteratively deletes cells to test the extent to which a cell is particularly important. So it works on a gridded version of the world and rapidly, iteratively eats through and deletes and returns and deletes and returns pixels to identify whether those are essential in terms of meeting species targets. Alternatively, I work a lot in the target-based prioritization world, which uses typically simulated annealing to approximate good solutions to rather than finding exact solutions. So we often are looking at close to optimal, but not quite optimal, but therefore you can look through a lot of spatial options, which tends to be better for decision makers who need flexibility rather than precision. And then looking into the future and forecasting decisions tends to be one of stochastic dynamic modeling. And I think that's where it could be really exciting to use landscape level modeling of future loss. And you bring that into your optimization of where to act and when to act and switch points in acting based on stochastic dynamic modeling.
Cool. So that's it. Yeah. So some really diverse range of like stats optimization and all sorts of cool stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I love a
fantastic.
good model play. So anyone who wants to play models, yes, please. And I also like the other thing I probably didn't show here, but I also think is incredibly powerful when it comes to that question of humans interacting in space, is once you have landscape models of loss or change, then agent-based modeling of how humans might interact with that, and be given that at a landscape scale, humans act quite rationally. At an individual level, we're quite irrational, but at a group of organisms, we're very rational, especially in land use. It becomes very, very robust to model agent-based decisions at a landscape level.
Thanks, Vanessa. Shane, I think, has a question.
Yeah. So many apologies. I missed the first half of your talk, but I found the second half really fascinating. Yeah, I silly alarm didn't go off on my computer. But just what you were saying then, in fact, I was about to write you an email in case I embarrass myself by what I'm about to say, right? But may as well say it. So especially what you just said then with your prioritizing algorithms. So I know people with Landcare Tasmania, and they're exactly looking at that at the moment. They want to have some advice on when they're allocating funds to community groups to do land care activities, how should they be prioritizing it? So they'd like to be doing that a bit more formally than just based on hearsay. So, I was just wondering, have you contacted Landcare Tasmania?
Yes.
And if not,
I'm meeting
I'd be
with
happy.
them in 1 hour.
Oh,
actually.
are you? All right. Well,
yes.
Tell them I say hi. But yeah, if you want to, I'd be interested in engaging with you on that sort of stuff as well. So I do statistical ecology and a bit of optimization as well. So
yeah, I'd love to. And yeah, I mean, it's really, Landcare is so exciting at the moment. So we're doing the target-based work with them with a tool called Marxan. And then they've they've looked at our zonation level maps, and they're working with another group that does more of the regional ecosystem modeling. Just to see which of the options is most fit for purpose. They tend to tell you similar but different things. So so I'm meeting with them to work through their Marxan results, and hopefully they'll make a choice around which is the right decision support. So yes, and more Landcare should be doing it. It's awesome.
Yeah, it makes sense now. Now, I knew I had heard of your stuff before because I was talking to them about that recently. So yes, good. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
So I guess with it being 12:59 or 11:59, depending on which time zone you believe in Australia, we probably should call things to a close. So thank you again, Vanessa. That was such a great talk. Really appreciate your time. I know you're very, very busy. And thank you to all audience. So thanks for everyone for joining us today. So a recording of the event will be available on the Plant Success YouTube channel soon if you wish to watch it again or to share it with others. And that's it. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Vanessa. Bye-bye.
See ya.